All hell is breaking loose for Donald Trump right now, and the panic inside his orbit is becoming impossible to hide. His disastrous gamble with Iran is exploding into a global nightmare, and the backlash is spreading across the entire world. Because what just happened is exactly the scenario Trump and his inner cabal feared the most. The very allies the United States depends on in moments of crisis are now openly rebuking him. Not quietly, not diplomatically, publicly, bluntly, and in ways that are deeply humiliating for the Trump regime. Across Europe and the Western alliance, leaders are warning that Trump's reckless military escalation against Iran is violating international law and dragging the world toward chaos. Governments that normally stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States are now refusing to participate. Some are openly condemning the strikes. Others are warning that this reckless escalation could ignite a catastrophic regional war. And instead of calming the situation like an actual leader, Donald Trump is doing what he always does when reality starts collapsing around him. He's lashing out, he's mocking allied leaders, he's threatening trade punishment against Spain, he's insulting the British Prime Minister. It's grotesque. And as drone strikes hit U.S. facilities across the Middle East and economic shockwaves ripple through global markets, one thing is becoming painfully obvious. Trump's so-called strategy isn't working. It's collapsing in real time. Now, here's the part that exposes just how grotesque this entire situation really is. Because Donald Trump and his allies spent years pretending they were the champions of strength on the world stage. Remember that line they love repeating? The world respected America when Trump was president. They said foreign leaders feared him. They said alliances were stronger than ever. That was the myth. That was the propaganda. And now the receipts are pouring in and they completely destroy that fantasy. Let's look at what's actually happening right now. Major U.S. allies are openly distancing themselves from Trump's escalation against Iran. France is making it clear the strikes were conducted outside international law and that they cannot support them. The United Kingdom is refusing to expose its military personnel to unlawful action. Spain is warning that this intervention is dangerous, unjustified, and pushing the world closer to catastrophe. Think about how extraordinary that is. These aren't fringe critics. These are America's closest partners, the very governments that Washington normally relies on during international crises. And instead of working with them, Trump is doing the exact opposite. Let's look at what he actually said. Trump is publicly mocking the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, saying this leader is no Winston Churchill. Imagine that. A U.S. president insulting the leader of one of America's most important allies in the middle of an international crisis. You can't make this up, and it gets worse. Trump is also threatening economic punishment against Spain after their government said the United States could not use Spanish bases for military operations tied to this conflict. Trump's response? Essentially bragging that the United States could just fly in and use the bases anyway. Let that sink in for a moment. A president of the United States openly talking about ignoring the sovereignty of allied nations. That's not diplomacy. That's authoritarian arrogance. And while all of this is happening, the consequences are already rippling across the world. Drone strikes are hitting U.S. facilities across the Middle East. Global markets are reacting. Major shipping routes are facing disruption. This is what happens when reckless leadership collides with reality. For years, Trump sold his followers a fantasy that he alone could dominate the world stage through bluster and threats. But now the truth is unfolding in real time. The world isn't rallying behind Trump. The world is pushing back. And that's exactly why the panic inside Trump's orbit is becoming impossible to hide. Now let's slow this down for a moment and actually look at the details of what's unfolding here, because when you dig into the facts, the situation becomes even more alarming. Let's start with what world leaders are actually saying. I want you to focus on this because it completely shatters the fantasy Trump and his MAGA media ecosystem keep selling, that the world respects and supports this reckless escalation. Let's look at one of the most striking statements. Canada's Prime Minister is speaking publicly about the conflict, and he makes something very clear. He says the United States and Israel moved forward with these strikes without engaging the United Nations and without consulting allies, including Canada. Think about that. One of America's closest allies is essentially saying they were blindsided. That's not leadership, that's diplomatic malpractice. Now let's look at another statement. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is making it absolutely clear that he will not expose British military personnel to unlawful action. He is emphasizing that before sending troops into danger, the action must be lawful and justified. Let me repeat that. Lawful. Because what Trump is doing here is raising serious questions across the world about whether this military escalation even complies with international law. And then we get to Spain. Spain's government is warning that this military intervention is unjustified and dangerous, and that it risks dragging the entire region into further chaos. They are explicitly calling for de-escalation and renewed diplomacy. Now, here's where the story becomes even more grotesque. Instead of addressing these concerns like a responsible leader, Trump is responding with mockery and threats. Let's look at what Trump actually says. He's attacking the British Prime Minister and complaining that this leader isn't Winston Churchill. That's the comparison Trump chooses to make in the middle of a growing international crisis. You can't make this up. Then Trump turns his attention to Spain, and what does he say? He starts threatening to cut off trade with the country entirely. Yes, an embargo against a NATO ally, and then he goes even further. Trump starts boasting that the United States could simply fly into Spanish military bases and use them whether Spain approves or not. Let that sink in. A U.S. president openly suggesting he could ignore the wishes of an allied nation and use their military infrastructure anyway. That's not diplomacy. That's imperial arrogance. But the consequences of this reckless behavior aren't just diplomatic embarrassment. They're real, they're dangerous, and they're already happening. We're now seeing reports of drone strikes hitting U.S. installations across the Middle East, explosions at American facilities, escalation spreading across the region. Meanwhile, the economic shockwaves are beginning to ripple across the global system. Shipping companies are reconsidering routes through the Strait of Hormuz. Asian economies that depend heavily on Middle Eastern oil are facing serious disruption. Markets are reacting to the growing instability. And that's exactly the kind of chain reaction experts warned about. When you launch reckless military actions without international coordination, you don't just create a local conflict. You create global instability, you disrupt energy markets, you threaten supply chains, and you put lives at risk. But here's the most disturbing part of all. Trump appears to believe that raw power and intimidation can simply force the rest of the world to fall in line. That's the magical thinking driving this entire disaster. Because the world isn't falling in line, the world is pushing back, and the deeper you look into this crisis, the clearer it becomes that Trump's reckless escalation isn't projecting strength. It's exposing weakness. And the longer this crisis unfolds, the more that weakness is being revealed to the entire world. And if you think this chaos is limited to one reckless decision about Iran, think again, because what we are witnessing right now is part of a much bigger pattern. This isn't a one-off mistake. This is what happens when a government is run by grievance, ego, and authoritarian magical thinking instead of competence. Look at the broader picture unfolding across the globe right now. The Middle East is already on edge, and now we're seeing direct attacks against U.S. facilities across the region. Drone strikes hitting American bases, explosions near diplomatic compounds, escalation spreading through multiple countries. That's not stability. That's the kind of regional chaos experts have warned about for decades. And it doesn't stop there, because while Trump is provoking conflict in the Middle East, the United States is simultaneously getting dragged into other confrontations around the world. For example, U.S. military operations are now taking place in Ecuador under the banner of fighting so-called narco-terrorism. American forces are working directly alongside the Ecuadorian government in new military operations targeting designated organizations. But even that situation is tangled in controversy. Investigative reports have raised serious questions about connections between political elites and international trafficking networks, and yet the Trump orbit is embracing these alliances anyway. Gross. This is exactly what happens when foreign policy becomes transactional and driven by personal relationships instead of national interest. And while all of this geopolitical chaos is unfolding, the economic consequences are already spreading across global markets. Let's talk about energy. Major shipping companies in Japan are now halting transit through the Strait of Hormuz because they fear the conflict could spiral out of control. That strait is one of the most important oil arteries on the planet. When that choke point becomes unstable, the ripple effects hit everywhere. Japan is already warning about potential oil shortages. South Korea's markets are reacting to the threat of disruption. Energy security across East Asia is suddenly under pressure. This is the real-world cost of reckless leadership. You destabilize one region and the shockwaves travel across the entire global economy, but perhaps the most outrageous development in this entire situation is how Trump appears to be trying to profit politically from the very crisis he helped create. Trump is now talking about using U.S. naval forces to escort oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz and offering government-backed insurance for maritime trade moving through the region. Think about that for a moment. The United States helps trigger a regional crisis, and then suddenly American military power is being deployed to secure the very shipping lanes now threatened by that crisis. You can't make this up. And here's the kicker. A huge portion of the oil moving through those shipping routes isn't even destined for the United States. It's going to countries like China, Japan, and South Korea. So, American taxpayers and American service members could end up bearing the risk for protecting global oil shipments created by a crisis that Trump helped ignite in the first place. That's not strategic leadership. That's reckless chaos wrapped in geopolitical theater. And the more you connect the dots from the Middle East to Latin America to global energy markets, the clearer the pattern becomes. This isn't strength. This is the unraveling of a dangerous and deeply incompetent approach to global leadership. So when you step back and look at the full picture, the difference here couldn't be clearer. This is the difference between leadership and chaos, between the rule of law and reckless authoritarian impulses. Right now, the entire world is reacting to the consequences of one man's disastrous decisions. Allies are warning about international law being violated. Global markets are shaking. Military tensions are spreading across multiple regions. And instead of taking responsibility, Donald Trump is doing what he always does when things start falling apart. He's attacking allies. He's threatening economic retaliation. He's pretending that brute force can replace diplomacy. But the truth is becoming impossible to ignore. The world isn't rallying behind Trump. The world is alarmed by him. And moments like this remind us why defending democratic institutions, international law, and responsible leadership actually matters. Because when reckless leaders gamble with global stability, the consequences don't stay confined to one country. They ripple across the entire planet. If you want more breakdowns like this, cutting through the propaganda and exposing what's really happening, make sure to hit subscribe. Let's keep growing this community and supporting independent journalism that holds power accountable.